can be pretty critical of the media I consume. I hadn't really given it much thought until recently, but I'm the type to drop a show in the middle of an episode if I get bored or annoyed, and a lot of the time I can get so distracted by shortcomings in media that it's hard for me to focus on the actual story. I often just keep these concerns to myself, as I'm not the type to vent criticisms openly on things like social media. However, I've gotten really positive feedback on my previous videos where I talked about media shortcomings and how to fix them. So for this video, I'm going to go into some of my biggest pet peeves in regards to art and writing. Things I see in major productions as well as in indie stuff like webcomics and even just around social media. And to be clear, this is all personal opinion. You're free to disagree with me about this stuff, and I encourage a discussion in the comments. Also, despite the topic, I don't want this video to get super duper negative, so we're gonna be having fun with it. And if applicable, I want to talk about how to avoid some of the things I mentioned in this video, sneaking in a little education and encouragement into it, like hiding your dog's pills inside a piece of cheese. Lastly, before we get into it, if you like learning about art and writing, then you're going to absolutely love this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with thousands of classes led by industry experts that teach you anything and everything you need to know about tackling a new creative passion. Whether it's art, animation, drawing, writing, design, or anything else you'd like to learn about, Skillshare has you covered. For example, I'm always looking to improve my art skills, and during my spare time, I've been checking out classes on different ways to do background painting, especially more stylized stuff, like in this class on creating stylized backgrounds for animation. Plus, I've been focusing on writing tips and advice a lot in my last few videos, and if that's a subject you want to learn more about, you should definitely check out Skillshare's learning path focused on developing memorable fictional characters, a series of classes that takes you through the basics of storytelling, building believable characters, and other helpful tips for writing. If you've enjoyed my videos talking about these topics, then Skillshare can help you dive even deeper into these concepts and teach you everything you need to improve. And unlike traditional classroom learning, Skillshare lets you go at your own pace and rewatch lessons again and again. It's a wonderful way to deepen your understanding of a subject or just to try out something new. The first 500 people to use the link in my description below will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started chasing that dream project and join Skillshare today. Alright, and with all that said and done, let's get into it, shall we? Let's start with some visual annoyances. And I want to start this off by saying, I love anime. This is not a secret. My art style has been pretty heavily influenced by anime ever since I was a little kid drawing Pokemon on my math worksheets. But anime also has a lot of visual and stylistic shortcuts that lots of art styles tend to fall back on, and a lot of them I also see translated into the works of artists I see online. And some of them have really started to grate on me. Maybe I'm just getting to my old curmudgeon era and this is me having an old man yells at cloud moment, but I really do feel like younger artists mimicking this artistic shorthand is stunting their creative growth a little. So let's start with noses. Where are the noses? Why do so many people just completely ignore giving their characters noses? Noses are cool, okay? And while they're not as emotive or expressive as other parts of the face, they're still a very interesting and versatile part of character design, and there's a lot you can do with them. I'll admit that my own art can have a bit of same face syndrome, mostly in the eyes. I just really like big expressive eyeballs, and I tend to fall back on giving most characters the same eye shape. This is something I'm working on behind the scenes right now. However, despite this, I've been pretty diligent about giving each of my characters unique nose shapes. Even though my art style tends to be pretty simplified, I made a point to give all my webcomics main cast a different nose. I think the worst offender in regards to this is when characters just have a little black dot to imply the presence of a nose without actually putting anything there. I see this a lot in more recent anime art styles, and I gotta be honest, I am not into it. You put these super detailed shiny anime eyes right next to that little stray pen mark afterthought of a nose, and it just feels, I don't know, lazy? Part of me wonders how much of this is from people thinking noses just aren't cute, and I think we need to change that. Noses are cute, okay? They're an important and visually interesting part of character designs, and they can help show expressions because of how they wrinkle around the edges when combined with big eyebrow and mouth movements. Just give your characters noses, please. And while we're on the topic of artists avoiding drawing things they don't like, here comes a bigger one that's gonna make some people mad. Backgrounds. Now, this one's more of a webcomic focused pet peeve, but so often I see webcomic artists focusing entirely on their characters and just completely ignoring the backgrounds. This can be less of an issue depending on the genre. If the comic is like a simple comedy comic strip with two people talking and the environment has absolutely no bearing on the substance of the strip, then that's fine, I guess. But I see so often, usually in series by newer artists, comics where the entire story is told with just talking heads. We never zoom out to see what the characters are doing, we're very, very rarely shown any environment detail, and in the rare instances we do see the backgrounds, they're extremely simplified and have no life to them at all. And I really think that's a shame. Backgrounds are a huge part of visual storytelling, and seeing people so blatantly ignoring them in favor of just drawing the fun characters over and over feels like kind of depressing in my eyes. Backgrounds can tell you so much about the setting and characters who live and exist in those spaces, so give them a little more, character. And it's not like you have to draw a super complex background in every single panel on every single comic page. Starting a scene with an establishing shot that really nails the environment often means that you can coast by on little to no background details in subsequent panels. If you want to study how and when to use backgrounds effectively, I recommend reading through your favorite comics and really paying attention to how and when they use more complex backgrounds versus when they use something very simple or even no backgrounds at all. All this is to say, backgrounds are neat, backgrounds are fun, and avoiding drawing them is shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to visual storytelling. If you want to be a better and more effective artist, learning to enjoy backgrounds will help you a lot. In conjunction with this one, another pet peeve I have is when comics don't zoom out enough. I see this especially often with action sequences. There's all this cool stuff happening on the page, but because the camera is constantly zoomed in way too close to the characters, it can be hard to see what's going on and really get invested in the flow of the action. There's a lot of webcomics I've read that are otherwise really fun and interesting, but it seems like the artist is so scared of drawing backgrounds that they don't zoom out to show us what's actually happening and give us the full visual context for a scene. And whenever I see this, I always wonder if part of that is just the artist being scared to zoom out more because then they have to draw more of the environment. Again, avoiding drawing backgrounds is not only going to limit you from an artistic standpoint, it's also going to make things more frustrating for your readers. Don't be afraid to push the camera further away to give your reader a more clear understanding of what's happening in your panels. I say this with all the love and encouragement in my heart. If you want to improve your visual storytelling, you should embrace drawing backgrounds. Backgrounds can be fun, so have fun with them. But don't ignore them just because you think they're not as fun as drawing characters. On the topic of pet peeves I see in webcomics a lot, let's transition over to a really important but often overlooked aspect of making comics: lettering. Lettering is one of those things I think a lot of newbie comic artists don't really pay that much attention to, but not giving your comics words the care and attention they need can really drag your comic down. I've seen a lot of comics with wonderful art, but terrible lettering, and every time I see it, it makes me a little itchy. If you want people to read your comic, it's pretty important that they can actually read it, right? And a comic with incredible art and story will be held back immensely if the lettering is bad or even subpar. Now, on the surface, lettering seems like a pretty simple thing. Just slap some words on the page, put it in a circle, and boom, you're done, we're all good. But actually no. There's a lot of best practices with lettering that exist to make the comic reading experience easier and more enjoyable, so let's go over those. Firstly, you ideally want your word balloons to be as even as possible. A really long or really squished word balloon like this can be really awkward to read. Also, you don't want to stick too many words in one word balloon. You should try to break up your dialogue into smaller chunks to make it easier to read. I've heard folks say that your dialogue balloon should never have more than 4 or 5 lines of text, and you should try to keep them as square as possible, and that typically works for me. Your words also need to fit comfortably inside your word balloons. Very often I see comics where the text is really small and the balloons take up way more space than they need to, or the text goes right to the edge of the balloons and makes it really hard to read. A tip I heard for this a while ago is to put a capital letter H between your words and the outline of your word balloons as a guideline for how much space to include. Also, I don't see this too often, but I have seen some comics do this thing where they almost shrink wrap the word balloons around the text, and this is just really annoying and difficult to read in general. Please don't do this. Now, this was just a really brief overview of some common mistakes I see in comic lettering all the time. If you want more advice on how to make the words in your comic better, I suggest checking out both Blambot's comic lettering tutorials and Bad Ink Studios' shorts on effective lettering. Both have really good tips that I'll have linked in the description. Okay, I went off on comic lettering for a while. Let's get a shorter one out of the way next, shall we? This is one I see all the time, and it feels dumb and pedantic to yell about, but I can't silence myself on this topic anymore, okay? So, if you are designing a character, and you give that character animal ears, you do not also need to give them human ears. Seriously, why do I see this so often? Why are you giving your characters 4 ears? Either give them animal ears or give them human ears. They do not need both. This drives me crazy. Every time I see it, there's no excuse for this. And I don't know, maybe it's because I was brought up on Tokyo Mew Mew, a show where the characters are magical girls with animal elements, and if they get animal ears in their transformations, their human ears disappear, which is how it should be for the record. But for some freaking reason, I constantly see people drawing their characters with both human and animal ears, and it's infuriating. Like, if the joke was that the animal ears were like fake costume ears so they weren't actually attached, then that would make sense and it wouldn't bother me so much. But no, in every instance of this I've seen, the animal ears are real and attached to their heads as well as the human ears. They have 4 ears and I hate it here. This annoyed me with Blake back when I used to watch Ruby, but I've noticed this a lot on VTubers recently as well. Animal-themed characters will have, you know, cute cat or dog or mouse ears or whatever on top of their head, but then their hair moves out of the way and you can say they have human ears too! What are you doing? Stop it with the human ears, I'm begging you! PSA to all character designers, if you are giving your character animal ears, please get rid of the human ones. I can't take this anymore. I am on my knees begging. And while we're on the subject of mildly pedantic whining about minor character design features, may I offer one that's potentially slightly more likely to start fights? Because guys, I can't handle Flesh Fang. I cannot stand the newfound influx of characters with Flesh Fang. I hate it. I can't stand it. It's so creepy looking. I do not like Flesh Fang. Please stop giving your characters Flesh Fang. If you're wondering, Star, what are you talking about? What is Flesh Fang? It's an art style trend, I guess, where instead of drawing a character with pointy teeth, they simplify it to the point where the little pointy tooth is the same color as their skin, and it just looks like the character has a pointy little tooth made of flesh. It looks like there's a stray vertex that they didn't rig right. There's a joke for my fellow 3D artists. I see this a lot in more recent anime and VTuber character designs, and it just looks so creepy, and I hate it when a cool design is ultimately ruined by Flesh Fang. I recently watched Jellyfish Don't Swim in the Night for the anime podcast my friend Sarah and I do. Go listen to our podcast, Idle Days, by the way. And one of the main characters, Kiwi, has the Flesh Fang. And Kiwi's a great character. They have a lot of interesting stuff going on, and I really enjoyed watching their sections of the show. But I could never fully get behind them as a character because of the stupid skin tooth. It looks so gross. And what's even worse is that I sometimes see characters drawn with both the Flesh Fang and actual teeth. Why are we doing this? The little skin triangle is supposed to represent teeth, and this just really drives home that it's part of their mouth that's attached to their lip. It's so creepy to look at. Seriously, all they need to do to fix this would be to draw a line across the top of the tooth and make it, you know, tooth-colored. Because, like, okay, I am an enjoyer of a character with cute little pointy teeth. My own VTuber has them, but why are people making them look like skin? Stop with the Flesh Fang. We've taken the abstraction too far. Please, I beg. It's gross and creepy, and I don't like it. Go away. Okay. Now that we've talked about some art pet peeves, let's talk about more writing ones. I feel like those are a little less pedantic and more interesting to talk about, so yay. So, if you guys have read my book on making webcomics or seen any of my other videos talking about the topic, you might know I'm not a big fan of information-heavy prologues. The kind of thing where you open a book or comic or start a new show or game, and the first thing you see is a huge dump of exposition and lore that you have to wade through before the story actually starts. And almost every single time a piece of media does this, I'm immediately checked out. Now, this isn't really a black or white issue. A prologue existing isn't inherently a bad thing, but there's definitely good and bad examples. I think the opening prologue in Avatar: The Last Airbender is a good example of a good prologue, because it's kept short and sweet and gives critical information to understanding the first episode of the show, as well as the entire series moving forward. On the other hand, despite it being one of my favorite games of all time, the prologue in The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is one I think is more poorly done. It's slow, pretty boring, and ultimately all the information in it could have been given by characters throughout the game rather than making the player sit through several minutes of exposition right at the start of the game. Additionally, I also think the medium has a lot to do with how enjoyable a prologue is. I'm more tolerant to prologues in TV shows or movies because I can just sit and absorb them while watching. But with comics and books where you have to actually slog through and read them, if a prologue is especially text-heavy or lasts more than a few pages, I'm pretty instantly checked out. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to start reading a new webcomic only to get hit with 10+ pages of, and then the gods created the angels, and the angels created the humans, and also cotton candy or whatever. And then once we finally get to the real characters and story, it has absolutely nothing to do with any of that lore that got just dropped unceremoniously into our laps at the start. Like, what's the point of putting that information right at the front? The opening of your story is supposed to hook you in and get you interested, not be a pile of mind-numbing text you have to slog through to get to the good parts. Baldur's Gate 3 is a game I got into recently, and it's a good example of a story that's really good at not front-loading all their information. While it does use a world and lore that a lot of players will be familiar with from playing Dungeons & Dragons, I think you could still have a positive experience if you were to go in completely new to the lore. The opening cutscene doesn't inundate you with things like, in the early times there were creatures called mind flayers, and they did a bunch of stuff and it was bad, and their goal is to take over the world by turning everyone else into mind flayers, blah blah blah, etc. The opening of the game drops you straight into the action. We see a lot of stuff that makes us immediately really curious as to what's going on, and we see enough to know the basics without being outright told. We're on a big ship that's kidnapping people, and there's evil squid guys doing evil squid guy things, very, very scary. And once we get control of our characters and get to start wandering around, we're given the most critical information first. We've been kidnapped by mind flayers, the technically guys, and we're given more information as we go. We aren't front-loaded with an entire world's worth of lore and origin mythos and trivia in the opening minutes. We're plunked down into something interesting and given information about the world and characters as it's needed for our understanding. TLDR, long info-dumpy prologues are annoying, but prologues can be done well if they're well integrated into the story. I generally prefer no prologue over something that feels like a textbook right at the start of a story. However, while I think that giving your viewer too much information is a net negative on the overall experience, I also think the opposite is true. Stories that don't give us enough information to understand what's going on can also be a problem, even though it's a problem I encounter less frequently. This was one of my bigger issues I talked about when I made my Has-Been Hotel video. The show has a lot of really unique and interesting concepts, but doesn't really explain a lot of them very well, to the point I was pretty confused about a lot of things while watching the series. I won't rehash the points I made in that video again, but I do want to focus on one point in particular. When I voiced these concerns in the video and talked about how I was confused about a lot of the world building and characters the show never fully explains, a lot of people in the comments told me that the answers to my questions could be found in extra materials, like the creators' tweets, old live streams, older comics, etc. And I said it in my Has-Been video, and I'll say it again here. If information is important for your viewer to understand your show, it needs to be in the show. I get so frustrated when a show is so focused on servicing people who are already familiar with the characters or story that they leave new viewers struggling and hung out to dry. This is actually a problem I see in a lot of anime that's based on mobile games, especially idle anime, since that's what I tend to watch a lot of due to the aforementioned Idle Anime podcast. Critical information about the characters is often left by the wayside, and anime-only viewers aren't given enough context to understand certain characters or scenes because the important information is in the original mobile game, or manga, or light novel, or whatever. On the one hand, this can work as an advertisement for the original piece of media and get people to seek that out for answers to their questions. But on the other, I always get so frustrated when a show relies on outside media for its story to be understandable that I usually don't even bother. It feels like an act of laziness on the writer's part. And I don't know, maybe that's fine for some people, But personally, I like it when a piece of media makes sense without me as a viewer needing to do homework to understand what's going on. I don't even need to come away from a show or game with complete understanding of every aspect of it. I just need it to make sense. I want to talk about Delicious in Dungeon for a second because this series is honestly a triumph of fantasy world building in my eyes. The world the characters inhabit is very rich, the world building is super interesting, and there's obviously so much love and care put into every aspect of the universe. But the series does such a good job of focusing on the characters and their journey, giving us exactly the amount of information we need to understand what's going on, but not so much that the story gets bogged down in extra world building detail. If people enjoy the series and want to learn more about the background detail, there's extra side material they can dig into and enjoy. However, at no point in reading this series did I ever feel like I was so confused I had to go digging for extra info. And that's what all stories should be. Figure out the information the audience needs and be sure to actually give it to them in your main piece of media. Don't bog down your story with too much world detail, but make it available if people want more. It can be a hard balance to strike, but it's a very important skill for writers to learn. And for clarity, I again want to say I don't mind if a show or game leaves me asking questions. I don't need every single question answered right away in order to enjoy a story. But there's a balance, right? If we're given all the answers up front, it's way too tedious, but if we're not given any answers at all, it's confusing and frustrating. A lot of learning how to write effectively is learning how to walk that line, and it's something I think a lot of writers, both in indie and mainstream media, maybe haven't quite mastered. And on the topic of lines one has to walk when writing, let's talk about tragedy. So here's the thing about me. I love a sad story. I love a story that makes me cry. There's a certain catharsis that comes from watching a character go through awful things and seeing how they respond to it. But I am also extremely picky with my sad stories. I feel like there's a thin line a writer has to balance on in order to make a sad story hit just right. On the one hand, the story not only has to have sad elements, but those sad elements have to actually, affect the characters in some way. Personally, I can't get into a lot of shonen series because it feels like the emotions just aren't as deep. The characters aren't given the time or space to really feel the emotions of the story they're going through, and their tragedies can often feel pretty shallow as a result. Like, yeah, you have a sad backstory, this bad thing happened to you, but what do you actually do with that grief? And how does it affect you in the long run? If a show doesn't really dive into those concepts, I tend to tune out and not care as much. But on the other hand, there are stories that do nothing but wallow in their own misery. Characters are constantly going through sadness and hardships, but never actually getting anything out of those situations. The biggest show I can think of that fits this feeling is The Walking Dead. I only ever watched the first few seasons, so this may have been improved on later, but watching the early seasons of that show felt like an exercise in suffering. These characters are in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, and there's no hope for any of them. And we as the audience are basically here to watch them be miserable and place our bets on which of them is going to die next. It got to be such a miserable viewing experience that I ended up just abandoning the show around the start of season 3. But see, that's the thing. I don't necessarily mind a miserable premise. I actually really love darker stories. While I've never played the games myself, I admit I have a bit of a morbid fascination with survival horror games like Resident Evil, and I've watched so many videos about fear and hunger, it's honestly a little embarrassing. But after thinking it over, I figured out that the key thing I need to stay invested in a depressing story like that is hope. And I know that sounds corny, but just hear me out. Let's go back to The Walking Dead again. It's a post-apocalypse story about a bunch of people trying to survive a zombie outbreak. They're very much trapped in their situation. They're struggling to stay alive, but that's about all they can do. There's no hope for getting rid of all the zombies. Even the places that feel somewhat safe are never safe for long, and you basically just watch the characters be miserable and die in horrific ways left and right. It almost felt like misery corn at times. However, let's compare that to another series. There's a little show that Rooster Teeth made a few years ago that I really enjoyed called Day 5. It's also a post-apocalypse story with a different premise. No one knows the exact cause, but for some reason, if people fall asleep, they die. As soon as your brain goes to sleep, boop, it's the forever sleep you don't wake up from. The survivors in the story are people who just happened to be awake when the disaster started, and throughout the course of the series, they're constantly struggling to keep themselves awake, and by extension, alive. It's stressful and upsetting to watch, and you're watching these characters get deeper and deeper into the mental anguish of literally not being able to rest. However, I loved Day 5. While I never watched the second season, I thought season 1 was a great miniseries that kept me hooked throughout the entire duration. Now, both of these stories place their characters in miserable life or death circumstances, but they have a big key difference: hope. The possibility of an end to their suffering that they can work towards. In Day 5, the characters are moving forward with a goal. If they can figure out what's causing people to die when they fall asleep, they can find a way to reverse it and solve the problem. While it's going to be miserable and difficult the entire time, there's still a chance. These characters are in a bad situation, but if they fight through and figure things out, they can survive. The problem can be fixed. However, in The Walking Dead, there's no cure for the zombies. There's no way to solve their problems, at least not that the show really explored during the seasons I watched. So rather than seeing compelling characters moving forward with the goal of salvaging their situation and surviving, it instead feels like a show wallowing in its own premise. All of these characters are going to die, and it's going to be horribly depressing the entire time. And it just makes me wonder, what's the point? What are we getting out of watching this? It got to a point where it almost feels like tragedy voyeurism. And while some people might get something out of that, it isn't something I want to put myself through. Anyway, long-winded discussion aside, the point I'm trying to make is, if you're going to write a sad story, there still needs to be something the characters are aiming for. They still have to have something that keeps them clinging to life. There needs to be hope. Even if it's just an unlikely spark at the edge of the horizon, give your characters something to keep going for. Because then I'll be able to cheer for them too. And lastly, this final pet peeve is a bit different. This is a problem I see all the time, constantly, in every medium. It's so widespread it almost feels impossible to avoid on the internet and in real life. And I'm not talking about things in a show or a game or comic. I'm not talking about the actual pieces of media themselves. This is a problem I have with creators. And not just one specific kind either. This problem is an epidemic across all creative disciplines, and it's especially a problem with young artists. And there's a good chance that you, dear viewer, have fallen victim to this as well. So if this is something you struggle with, then I am speaking this next section directly to you. Stop self-deprecating. I constantly see artists, writers, creators of all types, online and in person, talking badly about their own work, posting their work online for people to see, and accompanying it with trash talk about their own creations, saying things like, "My art sucks, this is so bad, I'm horrible at drawing," etc. And it's so sad to see. I almost feel like people think beating themselves up like this is a way to take the pressure off. Like, if I acknowledge that it's bad, other people saying it's bad won't hurt me. But I think some people are so obsessed with beating themselves down, hurting both themselves and their works in the process. And it doesn't do any good for anyone to treat yourself or your work that way. I do artist alley tables at conventions a lot, and I'll often get people coming up to me to show me their art, and before I even get a chance to look at their stuff, they're telling me about how bad their work is and I probably won't like it. And why would you open with that? At best, it makes me feel weird about looking at art that you clearly hate so much, and at absolute worst, it feels like you're fishing for compliments. But no matter where on the spectrums these interactions land, it's always awkward and kind of uncomfortable. This art is something you made with your hands. That's special. Even if you're not to the point where you're satisfied with your art, there's still merit to the fact you even have the drive to create at all. The first step to being good at something is being kind of mediocre at something. We all go through that. Give yourself a break. There's that old saying, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. And you know what? That applies to you too. Even if you have no confidence in your art and can't think of something nice to say about your work, then simply say nothing. But even that, I think, is thinking too little of yourself. Every piece of art, no matter if it was made by a complete amateur or a seasoned expert, has worth, has merit, has value, and a purpose, even if that purpose is just the creator having fun. I'm not in love with every single piece I make. I give up and restart art pieces all the time if they aren't working. Art is hard, it's frustrating, but that doesn't mean that art doesn't have value. Every step is a step forward, no matter how small. Something I read a long time ago and really stuck with me described how art is like a garden. When you first start the garden, you'll probably kill a lot of your plants. You'll accidentally overwater them and they'll rot, or underwater them and they'll dry up. This can be really disheartening, and a lot of aspiring artists never make it past this stage. What's the point of trying if nothing I try to grow ever comes out right? But here's the thing. Art is like a garden, and those early plants that died, they fall back into the soil and become fertilizer for whatever the next plants will be. And those next plants will be able to thrive better because of the nutrients left behind by those first plants that didn't make it. If all you do is point at your dead plants and say, "This is garbage and I suck," you're just wallowing in your own misery, and you're robbing yourself of the opportunity to grow and improve. So, if you need someone to tell you this, then I will. Stop being so hard on yourself. Stop putting yourself down because you haven't made it to the level you want yet. Stop digging a hole to bury yourself in. The universe is already hell-bent on making life so much harder for all of us every single step of the way. The last thing you need to be doing is helping it. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to your creations, and try to take each piece as an opportunity to learn and grow. The best artists are the ones that never gave up. And I can't wait to see what kind of artist you'll become. All right, and that's all I have for this one, but before we go, it's time for Star's Webcomic Corner, the part of the video where I talk about some of my favorite webcomics, boost my fellow creators, and hopefully give you guys something new and fun to read. Earlier in this video, I talked about my not-so-secret love of darker stories, so it feels fitting to talk about one of my absolute favorites in this one. So, without further ado... It's been 15 years since the fall, and the last remnants of humanity struggle to stay alive under constantly looming threats. Horrifying monsters roam the world, devouring all they see. Cults to so-called gods sacrifice their victims on bloody altars, and massive clouds of supernatural fog twist the minds of all those who were unfortunate enough to stumble into them. And while most of humanity lives within the relative safety of the districts, the no man's land calls to those who are desperate enough to seek out what they've lost. Soul to Call is a post-apocalyptic horror comic following Avril, a snarky courier searching for her missing father. However, on her way, she keeps running into trouble. Trouble like Eli, a timid boy with supernatural abilities, and the Order, a ruthless organization fighting against the monsters and cultists who threaten what's left of humanity. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a sucker for a darker story, and Soul to Call is one that truly keeps you on the edge of your seat. These characters are in a constant life or death fight to stay alive, and the action is intense and violent, but it never feels completely hopeless. The characters are all competent and extremely compelling, but also wonderfully human, and genuine moments of simple joy sprinkled throughout the narrative really help you feel connected to them and their struggles. Despite the horror genre, Soul to Call isn't a story that wallows in muted shades of gray. The color palette is bright and vibrant, giving an incredible energy to every moment spent in its post-apocalyptic hellscape. And all parts of the comic are lovingly rendered, from the characters to the environments to the horrifying monsters that constantly threaten the cast. This is a comic I've been following for its entire 10-year run, and it's one I'm always happy to recommend. If you'd like to check out the comic for yourself, you can read the entire series for free on the website. Do mind the content warnings, as it is a comic recommended for mature audiences, but I'll have the link in the description if you'd like to check it out. And we've made it to the end! Thanks for watching, everybody! Since I didn't say it up front, the art in this video was done for my Webcomic Castoff's May Mail Club set. The print is no longer available, but the leftover stickers are in my shop while supplies last, so make sure to go grab them. A huge thank you as always to all my Patreon supporters who make these videos possible, and a special thank you to my video shout out to your patrons, Jared, Holly, and Mr. Donmatsu. Thank you for enabling my anti-Fleshfang propaganda. If you'd like to join them, a link to my Patreon is down in the description. Anyway, that's all from me. Take care, friends, and have a good rest of your day. Bye!